Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this special occasion, the launch of a book dedicated to Slovak literature. Slovak literature is a rich and inspiring. I try to call my colleague because both of us, I'm director of Slovak Institute, and my colleague Claudia, she is diplomat working for Slovak Embassy, and we are very happy to have you here. And I would like just to continue. Slovak literature is a rich and inspiring reflection of our history, tradition and identity. I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who contributed to this project. The authors, publishers and all those who helped bring this book to life. And now please let me pass the floor to my colleague and ask her for a few words.
So ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Slovak Embassy. I'm very pleased we could co-organize such a great evening with the Slovak Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome all the three editors here at the Embassy, and Tim will introduce them more in details. And have a great evening, have a lot of questions, and Tim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to the Slovak Embassy for what should be a really special evening to celebrate something that's quite special. My name's Tim Beasley-Murray. I'm Associate Professor of European Thought and Culture at University College London. But once, a long time ago, in a dim and distant past, about nearly 30 years ago, I was told, I got a job to teach Slovak language and literature, and about at the time I didn't know the language and I didn't know the literature, and I had to spend a summer, right, reading up and trying to transform my Czech into something that approximated to Slovak and trying to get my head around this literature. And this book, right, unfortunately arrives 30 years late, because this book is precisely what I would have needed. And I'm going to say some words about what I really like about this book and why it's a genuinely valuable contribution, a contribution to Slovak culture and its literature, a real testament, a confident testament, I shall talk about that in a moment, to what that literature has achieved, but also a gift, I guess, to the Anglophone reader, right, who wants, and I think if they pick up this book, will be persuaded that they should want to know more about this incredibly rich and undeservedly, perhaps too little known group of writers, in Slovakia over the last, well, this really is particularly the last sort of 80 years or something this is talking about. But first of all, I need to introduce our speakers. I apologise, I have it here on my jelly bone. It's nice to be here to see old friends, but also some new friends, and in particular first, because he's sitting on my right, I'm going to introduce is Charles Sabatos, who is, let me see, well I know where Charles is. Professor of English Language and Literature at Yeditepe University in Istanbul, where he teaches comparative and world literature. He's the author of a monograph entitled Frontier Orientalism and the Turkish Image in Central European Literature, and his translations of Slovak and Czech literature include Pavel Velikovsky's Evergreen Is. I just want to say that was a really landmark translation when that came up. Charles was, we were both younger at the time. Charles took on a notoriously difficult but very important piece of experimental postmodernist writing that was written, I think, in the 1960s, but doesn't come out in Slovak till 1989. And Charles took it on full of bravado and ambition and produced a really landmark. I think it was one of the really important first steps towards the other great work that I'll come on to a moment that's been done in recent years in Slovak literature. Really excitingly, Charles has done something no less ambitious, which is he's taken on probably my favourite writer in Slovak, the extraordinary Hungarian, Slovak, Jewish, medic, scientist, writer Géza Vámos, and he has translated, or is translating, it's coming out.
It's finished, but
it's
it hasn't come out yet.
Hasn't come out yet, but his incredible Atomy Boha, God's Atoms that will come out, and that's going to be a really big deal. So it's great to see you here, Charles, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this volume. Next, let me see. Well, I'm going to go by the order that's on here, not by seating. Ivana Taranenková. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to London. Ivana is Senior Research Fellow and Director, no less, of the Institute of Slovak Literature at the Slovak Academy of Sciences, where she looks at an incredible range of things: literary criticism, history of Slovak literature in the 19th century, focusing particularly on questions of national and cultural identity. We may talk more about those. And she also works on contemporary Slovak writing and has a chapter, of course, in this volume. She's an author of a book entitled Fenomen Vajanský, a phenomenon named Vajanský, and lots of journal articles in her field, as well as playing a really important function in co-authoring, co-editing volumes on 20th, 21st century literature. So it's absolutely right that she should be behind this fantastic editorial project. And then finally, Katarína, whom it has been a pleasure to meet, but only today. Katarína Gephardt is Professor of English at Kennesaw State University in metropolitan Atlanta, but she is definitely bicultural, having been born and raised in Bratislava, and now in the States, where her specialization is primarily British literature. So maybe you're going to tell us something about how we work as well as the other way around. She's done a lot of research, really interesting research, on representations of Eastern Europe in British travel writing. Some of you may know that the most important mention of the Slovaks in English literature is in the very first, or British literature, shall we say, is in the very first pages of Bram Stoker's Dracula, where they're presented as being frightening but ultimately harmless, or something like that. But yes, she's the author of The Idea of Europe in British Travel Narrative, 1789 to 1918, and her current research focuses on 19th century British women travellers in Central and Eastern Europe. So it's fantastic to see the three of you today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I also want to mention a couple of other people who are hiding in the audience and perhaps might be better placed to take part in this discussion than I am. Rajendra Chitnis, who is Oxford's finest scholar on Czech, but importantly Slovak literature. I think what Rajendra has done right from his PhD is really not view Slovak as an afterthought, but put Slovak at the centre of admittedly a broad field of the way he approaches Slovak literature, Czech, Slovak, and also Russian literature. And his chapter in this one is really quite a nice and bold chapter that, yes, describes important developments in Slovak literature in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, but also makes a case, a little bit of a backhanded takedown of the Czechs, and argues that really it's not the Slovaks who need to catch up with the Czechs, but the history of 20th century literature shows the Czechs who need to catch up with the Slovaks, who are well ahead of them in various ways. So, I mean, I know they're just sitting over there, our fine přátelé čeští, but we're sitting in the Slovak embassy, so we can talk like that. And the other, I think the most important person here is Julia Sherwood, who, goodness, I don't think we could have an event like this about Slovak literature in English without Julia, who single-handedly, no, genuinely, I mean, we're in the embassy, we're between ambassadors, but if an ambassador here, I were to say to her or him that there should be some Slovak state prize for Julia for what she has done with Peter Sherwood, her husband, translating an incredible range of Slovak fiction into English. I mean, it's phenomenal. You know, when did you start doing that, Julia? When was your first one that came out?
2011.
2011. Well, in 2010, what you could have read in English translation, and Charles has contributed to the bibliography of the English translations of Slovak literature, so you will know this better than I do. In 2010, there was very little. It was really a sorry state, whereas since then, in goodness knows how many volumes, I think we started off with Sam Kotale, the Katarína, your latest one, and goodness knows, Kristufek, when did that come out? I don't know what there is, but we should look at Charles's bibliography. No one has done more to make, in high quality translations, to make Slovak literature accessible to a readership that only reads in English. Anyway, we are here to celebrate this wonderful publication. The title of which I quite like is Home and the World. It's a sort of confident title that sort of says Home and the World in Slovak Writing, a small nation's literature in context, that was edited by Katarína, Gephardt, Charles Sabatos and Ivana Taranenková. If I say confident, that's the first one. I'm going to make 3 points of things that I like about this book. Very often, you know, so-called small nations, and there's an interesting discussion of what it means to be a small nation and have small literature, have a tendency to present themselves as such, have a tendency to look over their shoulders and to worry about their place in the world. And there's a little bit of a strand, one can even see that in the words of the Slovak national anthem, we're still here, we're just about still here, but the Slovaks had to have that view. This book has nothing of that. It's sort of almost like it's a self-evident, that Slovak literature is here, that it's rich, that it's valuable, that it stands alongside its near neighbours. We've talked about Czech, but there's an interesting discussion in the introduction about the relation, or is it the prologue, the foreword, to Hungarian and Polish and so on, but also world literature, and I think that's great. I think this is a book that presents Slovak literature in a confident way, that also means that it's not, that it's capable of certain self-criticism. We don't have grandiose exaggerations of some great Moravian past or some tradition of Slovakized Czech in the Baroque period. It accepts that Slovak literature has its limitations, that it's quite a recent arrival at the party of world literature, but it's all the better for that, you know, ability occasionally to criticise itself. That shows, I think, a sort of a real confidence in what Slovak writers have done over the last, shall we say, century. The second point I want to make about it is it's not obsessed. This book is not obsessed with what is Slovak about Slovak literature. Now, this might seem a little bit of an odd point, but I'm referring here to a famous essay by the Argentine writer Borges, where he talks about Latin American literature, about Argentine literature. And he says, you know, in the Quran, you never read anything about camels. Right? In the Quran, you never read anything about camels. That's because you don't have to, because it's self-evident. They're so obviously camels in the world of the Quran that you don't have to talk about them. And he says for Argentine literature, that means if we're going to write a proper Argentine literature, we don't have to have gauchos and the pampas and beefsteaks and I don't know whatever. We don't have to have cliches of what it is to be Argentine. We just write literature. And I think this book it gets this sense that Slovak literature doesn't have to be all about shepherds and mountains and I don't know what, right? You know. Halushki or whatever, but actually, just in the same way that we don't ask English literature to be demonstratively English, right? But English literature can talk about, you know, the condition humaine. Actually, that's probably French literature that talks about the human condition in that way. And we don't ask French literature to be consciously French and wave its baguette in our face. So Slovak literature can talk about what it means to, yes, it talks about the Slovak history. There's a lot here about the legacy of communism, or the Second War, or the Slovak National Uprising, or 1989, but it can also talk about general themes, right? And it doesn't have to be Slovak, right? It can be about, you know, for example, Ivana, your chapter on autofiction, and that is your one, isn't it? Sorry, I was worried I was going to mix up that. But, you know, you can think about the problems of articulating the self in literature, and do so in a way that doesn't have to be about articulating a Slovak self. Right? And you talk actually about the liberation of Slovak literature from the burden of the collective, that we can actually just talk about what it means to be a human being, right? And I think that's really good. My third point, and then I will be quiet, is that it presents a Slovakia that's diverse, right? So when Julia, you and I were here 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't know, not the last time I was in the Slovak embassy, but nearly, and there's this Daedalus anthology of Slovak literature. We did a little event, it was very fun, and there was a nice Slovak writer, and I forget, who was the person?
Monika Kompaníková.
Kompaníková, of course. So a great Slovak writer, who happens to be a woman, was here, and we were presenting this anthology of Slovak fiction, which had about, I don't know, 20 things in it, and 1.5 were by women, right? And it was embarrassing. I mean, frankly, it was a little bit embarrassing, particularly when we had a really serious woman author with us. Whereas here in this volume, it's self-evident, right? The women are a really important part of the story of Slovak literature, whether it's Blažková, Kovalyk, or whoever these people are, whether it's contemporary writers. Yes, there is one chapter particularly on women's writings, but the women's writing is shot through the rest of the chapters as an important part of that story, and I think that's a real change, and I think that's really important. It's not simply diversity in terms of gender. I really enjoyed the chapter on, I think the writer, I forget who did that chapter. Radopasia, exactly. On Slovakia's blind spots of its borderland. So he writes about Slovak literature, about Rusinia, about the Rusin experience. He writes about Slovak writers either dealing with Romany questions or actually Romany writers. He talks about the Hungarian South and so on, and somehow makes us realize that, of course, Slovak literary sphere isn't just Central Slovakia. Once again, there's shepherds and mountains and things like that, but actually it's part of a much more diverse, ethnically diverse society, linguistically diverse society, and that plays a part of what it means to be Slovak, right? So yes, I like the fact it's confident, I like the fact it's, what was the second point I made? Oh, that it's un-Slovak, and then in some that ways it's more Slovak, because it presents us a really real picture of Slovak life. And I like the fact that this picture of Slovak literature is one that is diverse in across a whole number of vectors. So we do have, I mean, I'm sorry, we have to have some discussion before we raise a glass of something in celebration of this volume, but we certainly have something to celebrate. This is a fantastic achievement, and Charles and Katarína and Ivana, thank you very much for bringing this book into the world. Okay, well, now I will be quiet, and I just want, I hope we can have quite an open discussion with you as well, taking part with questions and comments and so on. But first of all, I think, Katarína, I'd just like you to maybe sort of tell us a little bit of the story of this book, where it came from, what you were trying to aim with it. What is this book trying to do? Who's it for? What function you think it's going to fulfill in the world?
Yes, well, maybe I'll start with a little bit of the history. Like Tim, actually, 20 years ago or so, I was a newly minted assistant professor in Metro Atlanta, where I teach mostly British literature, some world literature. And I needed a book like this because I was taking 7 students to Slovakia, students who had never been anywhere out of the United States, any of those 7. And I needed to come up with a syllabus on Central European literature, and nothing like this really existed for any of the Central European literatures. And to my knowledge, only Polish literature has something similar now that kind of provides this kind of overview, a kind of a roadmap for what to read, what are the key themes, what are the key historical markers. And so after that I taught Central European literature in translation. Charles's translation was available, but there was very little. I had the same experience, and it was the idea was in my mind. I worked on that other book on travel writing, and then I was noticing on social media Julia's translations coming out, and there was this sort of activity around Slovak literature, and I kept thinking, like, maybe this is the time to think about the book. And I decided to test myself by publishing an article, because I'm in British studies, I'm not an expert. I was in the extraordinary position of sort of commissioning a book for which I was the audience, or target audience. So I needed people to work with. So I contacted Julia, and she was just organizing a conference or an event that celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution here in London. There was an event to which Ivana and Charles were also invited, and I invited them to, at that conference I presented the idea, and there was some discussion on whether this book could even be published, whether anybody would even publish it, because Slovakia is so small and it's kind of a hard sell. And we decided to try, so we came up with an abstract, and I invited them because they were experts. You know, Charles did the pioneering translation and an expert in comparative literature. And even crucially, I needed an expert in Slovak literature to have some legitimacy. So it was absolutely invaluable. So I saw myself as a kind of a facilitator. And we did manage to convince McGill to publish the book because they had previously published Peter Petro's History of Slovak Literature in the 90s. And the last book that was published in English, sort of as a secondary source, was Robert Pinson's kind of a collection that I think came out of a conference. I think, Tim, did you contribute to that?
That was even before my time.
Okay, that was even before your time, I wasn't sure. So there was nothing, for 30 years there was nothing, and so McGill did accept the proposal, and our goal was to have a book that wasn't just for academic audiences, but could serve as a kind of a guide for general readers, for descendants of immigrants in the US, Britain, all over the world who want to be introduced to Slovak culture through Slovak literature and don't know where to start, because I was one of those people. You know, I needed a place to start, I needed to know what was important and what to assign to my students. And now that we have all these translations, we wanted to focus the chapters on the translated work so that English-speaking readers who don't read Slovak can get that access and know how to contextualize the translated work. So hopefully some of you will find it interesting or helpful as well. So I think that's maybe enough for the introduction. I'll hand it over.
Super, thank you so much. I mean, it's interesting. We have a Slovak in the US, we have a Slovak for Slovakia, and we have Charles, who's teaching Slovak sometimes in Istanbul. Ivana, I wonder whether, you're director of the Institute of Slovak Literature at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. And there are a whole number of Slovak colleagues working in Slovakia who work with you on this project. I was wondering if you could tell us how you see this project, which is a little bit, you're an insider, and this is a book in some ways aimed at outsiders. Maybe you could tell us how you got involved and how you understand this.
There are actually two mics.
Oh yes. Yeah.
So, the first thing I would like to tell that for me it was a great opportunity to bring two perspectives together. Perspective of domestic researcher on Slovak literature and perspective of experts on Slovak literature from abroad. So it seemed to me that for a very long time it was like parallel, like you did something, you provoked us, and we just we were enraged, how dare they, and it was I didn't like it to be frank. I mean those two like isolated researchers, and my first idea when we spoke with Katarína was bring them together, let's have a volume and where those views can be together, and it wasn't surprised. Like I said, I wasn't surprised that they didn't differ. I think that it's something that enrich both sides. On the other in one case, I can say that Slovak researchers sometimes has stereotypes in their research that they can't do anything with it, and the perspective from abroad or from outside can enrich our research. So for me, it was very important. It's not just confront the perspectives, but bring them together in a very interesting diverse unity. And I think this communication between us, people who are in Bratislava and people who are in London, Istanbul and Krakow, because we have also collaborated from Poland, it's very important because it can bring a very valuable value in dialogue. So this was my point, and this is why as a director of our institute, I really push my people to go abroad and to present their research, and I'm very happy when somebody from abroad comes and collaborate with us, because it can help Slovak literature studies to be even more visible.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this book is a testament to that. If there's one thing that's really super useful in this book, it's the introduction, right, which is 50 pages, really, of the cultural history of modern Slovakia through its literature. And the three of you co-wrote that introduction, which really, when does it take? It takes us from Stur onwards pretty quickly before it hits the 20th century, but it gives a cultural history of Slovakia in the light of, the creation of Czechoslovakia, the struggle for nationhood, the experience of the Second World War, the Slovak uprising, Stalinism, the thaw, 1989 and so on. Charles, could you talk to us a little bit about what it was like working with Katarína and Ivana on that introduction?
Sure. So I came onto the project slightly later. Katarína asked me to sort of help both proofreading and also contributing. But I was part of the original conference that this came out of in 2019. And just as an aside, everyone is sort of mentioning a similar thought to what I had, that we wish that something like this had been available for us when we were starting off, and particularly for me because I was starting out as a doctoral student in comparative literature, and there's really no framework for studying Slovak literature in the US, and that's still pretty much true even today. So I was relying to a great extent on the work of Robert Pinsent, who was the professor at UCL, and his work was really important in that he focused on both Czech and Slovak, and that's something that in the US, in Slavic studies and in Czech studies, was not the case, and is still really not the case. So his book, Modern Slovak Prose, which Katarína mentioned, that covered sort of mid 20th century, mostly up until 1989. But that book gave me sort of a direction of what I wanted to look at. And the real distinction, I sort of see this book as picking up where that book left off, because that conference took place in 1990, so those articles cover up until 1989. So what we did with this project is, the main body of the book covers from 1989, but our introduction leads up to that. So, except for Regenera's chapter, which does get a little further back, Todorovitz's chapter covers sort of crossing over right before 89 to the early 90s, but most of the chapters cover the 1990s to the present. And our introduction, we sort of went back and forth a little bit on how detailed it should get and what it should include, because obviously we didn't want to just jump in 1989, but we didn't want to necessarily put too much focus on things that were not the main topic of the book. So it was really the background to help the reader, and especially because this was aimed at a sort of a broader readership, at least people in Slavic studies, comparative literature, world literature, but it would allow them to approach the chapters which are a little more detailed. And I think we all sort of contributed ideas. Katarína and Ivana mostly did the outline of the history of Slovak literature. I included a section which was really relevant to my experience, which was the previous criticism of Slovak literature in English. That was mainly my contribution to the introduction, because that's the material I had to work with back when I was starting out. And I think we went through various versions, and obviously there are certain things that get left out and overlooked in such a broad topic. But all in all, I think it serves the main function of setting up the real focus of the book, which are the contributions from the other scholars.
That's really interesting. Just as a slight aside, if I may, because we're here in London, Professor Robert Pinsent has been mentioned a couple of times, who was a sui generis scholar here of scholar Czech, and of course, as you mentioned, Charles, Slovak literature. Some of this book seems to be an attempt both to build on and escape Robert's legacy, right? Which is interesting. He was such a towering figure in the field. But I was going to ask about something else. This book largely, and I think it's helpful as a result, focuses on those works by Slovak writers that have been translated into English. And as I say, because of Julia's efforts, but also other things, we are beginning to get something of a picture, right? We have Velikovsky and we have Piščanek, which are the topics of Petr Dalarex's chapter, really important sort of alternatives in a sort of postmodernist literature that weirdly comes out was written before 1989, and then we were getting a bigger, more fuller picture of what post-1989 literature looks like. It was a pleasure for me, by the way. I basically stopped reading Slovak literature about 2003. So I discovered lots and lots of things here that I'll have to go and look more at. But I want to ask about this balance between talking about literature that an English reader could read if she wanted to, he could get his hands on it, and then the other stuff which hasn't unfortunately yet been translated. How do you deal with that? I mean, Rajendra's chapter deals with Bednar Hodiny a Minuty, Bednar's work, and that is coming out. That's something we could celebrate as well. That's a really fantastic writing from the 1950s, isn't it? 54, 55. I mean, that will come out. But how did you deal with that balance between talking about things that the reader could get their hands on and talking about things that the reader can't yet get their hands on?
I'm just going to finish up on a thought that I meant to mention earlier, and I sort of got on a bit of a tangent regarding that collection from the conference, and the way that when I was looking at that in the early stages of my doctoral research, that was a very useful source, and actually one of the main reasons that I picked Velikovsky, the translation that you were kind enough to mention, was because his Robkinson's description was so intriguing in the book that that's why I started to read it, and then finally thought I should translate it. But the main thing about that, you've already mentioned, the huge difference between that book and this book is when I read that book, none of those, maybe one or two of those novels, Nemchko or something, were available in English. Almost none of the works discussed in those were available in English, whereas in this, in every chapter, at least one or two of the writers are available. And as you mentioned, Julia Sherwood, who's here with us, played a huge role in that, but not only in her own translation, but in helping to really cultivate a community of translators. And there's several translators that are working, and Julia helps to bring their work into these various new series and bring them to circulation. So I just wanted to add that, but I should pass this on to my colleagues on their thoughts on that.
Maybe I'll try and see if Ivana has anything else to say. It felt like filling in a puzzle. We felt like there are enough English translations now that the puzzle could be put together, but there were still missing pieces. Like in the chapter on regional writing, that was hard because not enough has been translated there. That was probably the one that had the least English translations, the fewest. But the principle was, if there was a representative English translation on that theme, like for women's writing, for expatriate, or whatever the theme of the chapter is, then I asked the contributors we asked the contributors to use those. And then there's obviously also things cited that are not, if we needed to fill in the trajectory that we needed to tell, the story we needed to tell. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was my kind of thinking.
There's one thing that we are lucky to get the momentum, like a bonus translation of Slovak literature into English, as is mentioned, thanks to Julia Sherwood and activities of Slovak Literature Centrum, led by Miroslava Valova, and really huge energy was put in those translations. And it was like in the situation that we were writing chapters, and parallelly the translations were made. For example, Jan Rosner, we started and there was no translation, and after I finished my chapter, I could use a translation made by Julia and Lisa Sherwood. So it went like parallelly, and I think that it continues because not just those translations will be published in Czech publishing house, Katarína. So I think the momentum continues, the boom continues, and the book just uses, and it was interesting.
I just wanted to say, for example, I used a quote from Fleeting Snow because the introduction was written last, and I could, Velikovsky's novel that sure was translated at the end because we couldn't fit it into the chapters. And Iohannides, I'm sorry. Iohannides was the author that at the conference we had 5 years ago was the one that people said should be translated. And so I was so excited that the translation came out that I put, I confused. It's not Velikovsky, it's Iohannides about crime does punish. I have jet lag, so please excuse me. Iohannides is about crime does punish, and I was very happy I could fit it into the introduction because it couldn't go into any of the chapters. So it was really a delight.
I mean, there's no doubt that the book reflects this, that things are getting a lot better, right, from this point of view. You know, for many years we would say, if there was one book, when we have these chats with Regenda and Peter and told me, if there's one book you could translate from Slovak, it would be the Iohannides, the Trestavucí zločin, If Crime Does Punish, or I forget how you translate it. But now it's there, right? And what I like, incidentally, is in addition to the Bednar, Bednar, it's a novel about the Slovak uprising. It makes this sort of equivalence between Nazism and Stalinism. It's really quite an important moment, quite unique for European literature in many ways. But there's a tendency, what I'm trying to say, for translations to concentrate only on the contemporary. And I think it's nice that gradually we can see things like Bednar being translated. I believe Lahola is coming out, right? So he was I'm reaching back into my memory. Writing in the 60s, he's writing about the Jewish experience of the Holocaust and what leads up to the Holocaust. Really, really amazing collection of short stories, right? That stand up there absolutely with the most harrowing but powerful European writing on that dreadful experience. So I mean, what I'm saying is that I think it's great that Slovak literature is beginning to be, the picture of it we get in English is being filled out also in a historical direction. Charles's Varmus translation will only contribute to that more. At some point, I'm going to ask the three of you, you can prepare yourselves for this question. If we could persuade Julia to translate the next thing, right, what should it be, right? Or someone else. So, what's the next thing? If we had to choose one book, and I want you to make your cases, we can have a balloon debate, maybe we can have a vote at the end, and whichever of these three choices wins the vote, sounds most persuasive, then Julia and Peter will have to go along and translate it next. But in the meantime, I'm going to say something slightly critical about the book. Not really, I'm just pretending to be critical. Because of the focus on translation, we have two chapters on poetry, and this may be me, it's not poetry's fault, it's my fault really, but I don't really, I don't engage with poetry after 1945 essentially. So we have these two chapters on poetry. For those who do like that, that's there, because poetry is often easier to translate, well, it's not easier, but it's short, right? It can be published in journals, and there's that. And what we don't get is drama, which I was sort of slightly disappointed about. Some of my fondest memories of interacting with Slovak culture is actually through the theatre, Klimáček's plays and things like this, and all sorts of productions. So I think, if you could have expanded the book, I think it's great we have this Borderlands chapter out of Ruthene and Hungarian and Roma Slovak literature. But if what about what's missing? What would a chapter on drama tell us here, and why don't we have one?
These were tough decisions, and a part of it was the length of the book, that it would have been, it's already 400 pages, and drama is something we considered at the beginning, but then ultimately we decided, because of the focus on translated works and the energy was in fiction especially, so fiction dominates. Actually, one of the readers of the book, the blind readers, also wanted more poetry, but there's a big chunk missing, and it's only sort of, as we say in the introduction, it's not comprehensive. We had to make some tough decisions. And it also depended on the expertise of the contributors and that were a part of the project. But yeah, we need another book for, especially drama would deserve attention.
A second edition.
Yeah.
But also I am aware that the great part of poetry is missing, because it came from a situation when our experts preferred the experimental line of poetry, and there are pretty, very interesting poems, written in traditional, not so experimental way, and we really thought very hard, but this was a result, and
That chapter, and in particular the one where we have a lot of Petr Šulej, don't we, with stuff written in Hindi, and we have Machovsky, these sort of strange texts. It's interesting that more traditional lyric poetry isn't in here.
And the other sort of conscious bias of the book, I just wanted to piggyback on what Ivana said, is the world part. We wanted to kind of also look at writing that looks outward and interacts with the wider world, and that's why I think we partly ended up with these trends as well that kind of correlate with abroad.
And the second thing was that we wanted to present contemporary Slovak literature, which was in the historical context, but still the emphasis was on the contemporary. And it's true that in contemporary poetry, this is it's funny thing because experimental poetry became mainstream in Slovak literature. So this was the reason. But as for this relation home and the world, it's not like you have like binary opposition. It's not. It's really it's kind of synthesis, because every time when it's a kind of release of Slovak literature and culture, it like gets inspiration, very strong inspiration from the world. And it creates something very unique for home, like something, as you mentioned, what is Slovak, what does it mean to be Slovak, what is Slovakness? So my Slovakness is that my origin is Hungarian and Ukrainian, and I'm here presenting a book about Slovak literature, as a Slovak by choice. But the other thing is that it's very diverse unity you have. Like it's always, I think every nation is in this situation that it draws, like it brings inspiration from outside and creates something unique and put it back in this communication to the world.
Yeah, I mean, you have a really nice, I can't remember whose words these are, but you say, Slovak literature can serve as a case study of how the culture of a small nation, historically conditioned by the struggle for national self-determination, so there's that sort of Central Europe, little nations we have to, make ourselves, can draw on its broader regional affiliation, so with Central Europe, with Czech or Hungarian or Polish or whatever, to sustain itself under the pressures of globalization, what it means living in, today's multi-connected, whatever we live in, while also drawing new inspirations from a wider world, right? I thought that was a really nice picture of the way that Slovak Slovak literature is nestled in its immediate context, that of the nation, its regional context, and then, the experience that all of us as citizens of the 21st century live in. I was interested in your chapter, Ivana, that, these days I do a lot more with, particularly with French literature, right? And you described this sort of auto-fictional term, right? You talk about Serge Bukowski and all this sort of stuff, blah, blah, blah. But it was just quite interesting, not having been following Slovak literature for quite a while, it seems to have ended up in quite a similar place as English language literature, Norwegian literature with Knausgaard, and of course French literature. And in a way that seems right, doesn't it? That Slovak writers have done something similar to what writers in a whole range of languages are doing, and ending up at a similar place, that questioning of the self and how we narrate the self. I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, there's this thing that I realized when I was writing my chapters, that for Slovak culture, it was always suspicious to be individual. It was always emphasis on collective self, but it never was like collective self. It was just part of like many personalities, individuals. If you remember, many of you maybe know, but it's always like Šturovci, but never Šturovci. There was Boto, there was Král, there was Sladkovič, everyone was different, and they created something like Slovak romanticism.
You argue that unlike, if you learn about romanticism in a school in the UK, it's all about the individual. Whereas you argue that Slovak romanticism rejects the idea of the individual. Wordsworth wandering around discovering daffodils or something, right? But argues for a sort of romantic collective figure.
Yeah, but they were, funny thing was they even denied they are romantic. Slovak romantics denied that they are romantic, but they were. and when the literature and culture was without pressure, the ideological pressure. The fourth side was like this individualism. As you remember, like Ioannidis' book, Privacy, Súkromie, as the first, like, it's always like that, like, bringing up my personal, individual, my own perspective and communicated it was with Sloboda, it was with Tatarka, and it was always like releasing ideology, those voices, individual voices came and enriched the culture. And for a long, like in postmodernism, of course, individual and things like that were complicated, and it's very interesting saying that, like, let's say in the beginning of the millennium, in the first decade of new millennium, suddenly people, like writers, struggle how to express how to communicate some, I mean, historical experiences, because they were like, were not trustworthy, like, because we know about ideology, and bringing this unique personal voice, remembrance, and this individual memory, and confronting those big historical events. So many people, writers found it as an authentic way of bringing the testimony of all of it. Because if you remember 90s, there was a call for this big, I mean, novel, like Balzacian, let's talk about. And it was so hard to communicate this experience because they didn't trust the words and things like that. And they brought this autofictional way of communicating. And now we are in the situation, to be frank, that it's really too much. We would like to have a story, like give us a story and create something which is not strong for your experience. It would be very good. Thank you very much.
Yes, you finish your chapter by saying, the question that remains is whether such pervasive subjectivity will eventually create a demand for literature about people and the world beyond the self. And, you know, I think autofiction can exhaust itself. One can gaze into one's own navel and drown in narcissistic or philosophy. What's interesting, I guess, about your chapter, sorry, I could talk about your chapter forever, is that obviously you have, you know, male writers who write against the collectivism of Slovak culture by focusing on the individual experience, like Sloboda, Tatarka, and so on, but also women's write fiction about their, or auto-fiction about their own experiences, really important. Varshava. It's a good example of actually women's writing not being peripheral, but actually being a central theme in the story that's being told in this book. Charles, we've talked a little bit about, you know, the Anglophone context and the Slovak context. How do you think your students in Istanbul will receive this book, and what use will they put? If we're talking about home and the world, you know, we're at home, I'm at home more or less in London, and you know, Ivana's at home in Slovakia. But what about the world that is beyond London and Slovakia? How do you think your students in Istanbul will read this?
Well, until now, I've mostly used Slovak literature in the context of a specific course I teach on the Turkish image in Central Europe. And I use a lot of these texts that focus on the Ottoman invasions and that kind of thing. So I haven't really used a lot of contemporary Slovak literature. However, last semester I had basically what I should say is that most of my teaching is in English literature, broadly defined, and when I do use Central European, sort of an elective European literature, it's not somebody that's working towards any, you know, long-term engagement, but the type of courses I do have been sort of these broader survey courses, and I have included Slovak writers in a few of those. But last semester I really decided to take a course I've done before, which is mostly modern Czech literature, and do a full balance between Czech and Slovak, like literally 50-50. So I
not 2/3, 1/3. I thought it was 2/3, 1/3.
No, it's even more than even not even population-wise, but so and so it was the first time I really used Ishtanik in a course of that type. We did reviews about it. Obviously, these are all English translations, and I'm doing sort of partial coverage of them. But they they seem to really like, not just the, I mean, they always like Schweik, they always like Čapek, and even now RUR, maybe even more than it used to be. They love Kundera, but now, this time, I did Petr Karvaš, I did Vamos, I used my own translation, which is, so I was sort of telling them, well, you're the first students to ever read this translation in the world, so feel privileged. And they responded to it, they enjoyed it. So in terms of, these more experimental works, I don't know. I've taught a course actually on autofiction for my doctoral students, and it would be interesting with some of these works now being translated to bring some of that in. So, I mean, it's interesting that Turkey, doesn't have they don't have much, connection with Central Europe, but yet historically, there is this, at least almost up to, not quite to Slovakia, but all the way to Hungary, there are these deep connections which a lot of my students aren't even aware of. So that's what I'm trying to build on historically, and then maybe we can bring that into the present with sort of this, things like this being available.
I'll open this out to the floor in a moment, but just before it, remind you mentioned of Pišťanek, says there's one ghost at this particular banquet that hasn't been mentioned. Well, he's not a ghost actually, but Donald Rayfield, who was behind, in fact, even though his name may not be on the cover, it probably ought to be, behind the translations of Pišťanek's Rivers of Babylon trilogy, which is just amazing. I mean, it's the most extraordinarily comic, grotesque, over-the-top trilogy that I can't even begin to describe it, but I think, Donald Rayfield basically decided to create a publishing house simply to get this book translated, did it on his own, and got these 3 volumes of this crazy, careering novel out into the world, and it's half the subject of, as I say, Danowitz's chapter here. But I guess Donald isn't here. No, he's not here. He's an expert on Georgian literature and Russian literature, but has this love for Slovak culture as well.
He was a huge admirer of Johannidas, especially. I don't know if we're going to get to the subject of what should be translated,
yes.
But he thought that
He can read Slovak.
Marek Konyar was the book he thought that
Marek Konyar completely defeated me. I could not read it. It was too difficult linguistically. Anyway, in any language you read, there's some book that just do you in. In French, it's Céline. I can't read. It's too difficult for me. But Marek Konyar was the book I can't read in Slovak. Anyway, priatelia, friends, it's over to you. We have 3 co-editors of these volumes, experts in Slovak literature. What would you like to know, and how can we open up the discussion a little bit? Obviously, I'm looking at you, Regina. You will have plenty of questions, but maybe someone else first.
Oh, wait a minute.
How difficult was it to get a positive response from McGill?
I was very lucky. I tried other publishers, a couple other publishers, not a lot. There was no interest. And I actually, to test myself as somebody who could co-edit the book on Slovak literature, my limited sort of condition for myself was to get an article published. It was on Veronika Šiklova and Marek Krajňák, and it was about nostalgia in contemporary Slovak literature. And that also took me 5 years to publish that article for various reasons, but ultimately Canadian Slavonic papers published it. So I had green light for myself now to try this book. And as luck would have it, the editor who worked with me, and is one of the best journal editors I've encountered, I never met one like them in Victorian studies, who was wonderfully supportive, and she, I think, spent some time in Prešov, although she focuses on Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian history. Hada Coleman is the name. And it occurred to me to contact her and ask if she had any suggestions about which press might be interested or publishing house. And she referred me to Richard Ratzlaff, who was the editor at McGill Queens, and He was previously at the University of Toronto Press, and somebody with a very vivid, sort of keen interest in anything Eastern European, especially Polish literature, and he was just amazing. Heather was great, but Richard was just amazing. I think the way he helped us, especially to frame, after we submitted, he wanted to vet the chapters before he sent it even out for review. And he read our introduction, and he really helped, even though I am abroad, so I do have this outside view. He gave us even more of a suggestion on how to frame it, so that it works for a wider range of readers, and not just somebody who's specifically interested in Slovak literature, but maybe in small literatures and translation, and so thanks to Richard taking this on and probably fighting for it a bit with the board and everybody at McGill, was my sense. It got published. He retired. I sort of wondered if our project finished it, but hopefully not. He retired just as the book went into production. So he really wanted to hear what was going to be said today. So thank you so much for recording, because that way Richard can listen.
And we should have added to the thanks, but definitely to McGill for having the will to go with this project. Yeah.
I'll ask. I think this is probably a question for Ivana, although it's related to the question that you asked Charles. And actually, that was how, in terms of looking at this book and thinking about how Slovaks today know about this period in their literary history, would you tell? Do they know this story? I suppose would be my first question. Is this something? Are these writers? Are these works? Is this approach familiar to them? And also, would you tell it differently to them than you would to an outside audience?
Well, yes, they know the same story, because every chapter, and there are, I think, the majority of Slovak author, or maybe it's a half. So this is a research we are really doing now, like in those days, or not those days, like we do it. And this was what I really wanted, to bring our research, and of course we had to modify it, because it's always different when you write for people outside. But this is something we are really working on, and we wanted to present it to the world. But the other one thing I would like to tell here is that you, as English-speaking readers, are in advance, because we don't have similar volume in Slovak, and this is what it's important for our institute, to write it in, or to bring something like this to our Slovak readers, because they are really demanding, and they want it when they criticize us that we don't have something like this, but we have it in English, because we decided to do it in English. So yes, this is the same. Maybe we explained you a little bit more some obvious facts and things, but it goes with this mission to bring it like.
But could I ask you, would it look differently from, dare I say it, an ideological perspective if it came out in Slovak?
No, it will be very, very same, because this is research we are doing. Because it's always in our institute, remember it? We are always reading against the grain, and because this is a kind of resistant reading. Always if you work with national, literature of 19th century, and that is always more interesting to read it against the grains.
That was exactly the answer I was expecting, but it's very good to hear it, right? That a book like this could come out in exactly the same way, with exactly the same slant and take on things. Anyone else? Oh, I saw the lady up there first, and then the guy there.
On a practical note, I haven't seen the book, but I'm wondering how it is organized. Is it like an anthology? Are there excerpts from, novels, or are there just short stories? Is there something about the author's lives, or I'm just wondering.
It is a kind of like a guide to Slovak literature. So it's a secondary source. It's not an anthology. There have been a couple of anthologies published of Slovak literature.
Into the Spotlight.
Into the Spotlight and the other one.
And that is one.
They're smaller anthologies, but so we didn't. Our aim wasn't to do an anthology, but there are chapters. It starts with a kind of a historical introduction about how Slovak history correlates with culture and literature and co-evolves. And then there's a couple of historical chapters that capture a couple of moments, like the post-Stalin thaw, which was Rajendra's, and the transition of the 90s. And then the rest of the chapters are thematically organized around various themes, like the South, which was Ivana's chapter, regional literature, women's writing, historical fiction, what else? Drawing a blank. Expat and expatriate and immigrant writing. Experimental writing, and also at the end we have an interview with Julia, and we have a little chapter by a translator, Magdalena Mulek, about the practice of translation. And then there's a bibliography of the titles in English that are currently available. And there are a couple of chapters on poetry, the more kind of experimental lines that look outward to the global. And so, yeah, there's a chapter on poetry and social engagement as well, and how social engagement has changed from sort of the socialist era to the present, and how sort of poets look at that over time.
That's a really good question. You should have said much more explicitly what's in the book. But yeah, it's a really useful handbook.
And we have a couple of copies you can browse, and we had a coupon available. So anybody would like to order it. The UK distributor may not have it yet, but it may be coming soon. And I got a discount from McGill for this audience. So we could probably email it. If it's not available here. Oh, maybe it is actually. There's copies there. So yeah, thank you so much for doing that. Yeah, there's copies of the flyer, so that way you can access it. It's also available as an ebook, but there's a discount.
Fantastic. Over here.
Yeah, so this is just sort of a general question, but obviously the book is called Home and the World, and have a sort of wary we want to be about generalizing about national characteristics. So in my own experience, my own family from Slovakia, I feel like Slovaks have this sort of two-sided view of how they relate to the world. And one of them is they love to complain about Slovakia to other people, and they love to talk about how Austria and Czech Republic and other countries are better off. But then they're also very fiercely sort of proud of being Slovak if someone else criticizes Slovakia. And I sort of wanted to ask how these sort of questions of self-perception are dealt with in the book, and how that relates to another question, which is Slovaks who have moved abroad, and sort of migrants, diasporic writing, and people who've moved back. And there's this Kundera book, Lignorovs, I think it's called. But I picked it up in a Slovak shop, and I read it in Slovak translation. And I really hated that book. It's sort of Kundera is most sleazy. But there's one theme in it which I thought resonated quite a lot, which is the idea of the sort of migrant who's come back to Czech Republic or Slovakia, and they've come into this world which so people are almost suspicious of them because they've lived in the West for a long time. And so I wanted to sort of ask
an awful lot to unpack there, but a great set of questions. I mean, I would suggest on the first one that, it's the nature of human beings to be gripped in an oscillation between envy and pride, right? Which is sort of what you described there. I just quickly want to quote something that absolutely goes to a question. Contemporary Slovak literature, the editors say, seems to suggest that the cultural legacy of Central European literature is very much alive, but the, inverted commas, self-pitying fatalism, end of quotation, is balanced with oblique, ironic perspectives on the dominant economic and political forces of our time through the perspective of 21st century everymen and everywomen. Right? So a sort of balance between Slovakia's tendency perhaps to sort of be self-pitying and think it's at the fate of other larger forces, but also playing a part in a broader global experience. But that's my attempt to answer part of it. What about the others? Katarína?
Maybe I'll just say a little bit sort of about my experience, because I'm an immigrant who's lived in the US since I was a student, 30 years plus now. And I sort of, unlike the chapter on expat and immigrants interested me, we kind of divided it with the older sort of immigrants who couldn't go back, especially with the focus on Brezhna and Blaškova's books, and then the newer millennial migrants who can go back, and kind of the chapter looks at those differences. And maybe like sort of my ulterior motive for this title also was that I always sort of swing back and forth between home and the world, because I keep going back. Even this book for me is a kind of a return. Maybe because I work in literature, culture, history, I just never could let go of Slovakia the way some of the other people in the immigrant community in Atlanta seem to have kind of let go there. And sometimes I'm jealous of them, but there is this, especially people who are tied to culture, and there's always this sort of push and pull. So the title has that kind of private dimension for me, but also it's, maybe we try to also avoid the self-pitying extremes and try to look at more at how Slovakia connects to the outside world. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a kind of two moments in this question. And the first is, as a national identity, I would really recommend Velikovsky Evergreen. So this is everything you wanted to ask, but you were afraid. Yeah, it's really genius. You can read it and you can really, and it's not just Slovaks. I think every small nation, it has something, and it's also like you think something is very specific for some nation, and you realize that somebody else invented it. As for example, if you see its national tendencies in Central Europe, they were invented somewhere else, like in Germany, for example. And so ever is green, and the other thing is that really this experience of being migrant or being away from home is very deeply rooted in Slovak literature. For example, if I may, I will use as an example from 19th century, and I really used to annoy people because there is an author called Martin Kukučin. And in Slovak literature, he's a synonym of Slovakness. He's somebody who wrote about Slovak villages and shepherds and things like that. And after that, you read his stories, and you have to read his biography, and you will know that he went away in very young age. He went to study medicine in Prague, and he never returned. So Slovakia, in his stories, is an invented place as he remembered in his childhood. And he is a deeply melancholic, nostalgic author who went to live in South America. He even bought some land from he was colonized, the Slovak colonizer. It was a very interesting perspective. But he never went back. And the second one, he was presented as an author or writer of Slovak village. He lived in Prague, and he has beautiful, beautiful stories situated in Prague, and no contemporary author in that time, Slovak author, could write something so capture the city, because Prague was city for Slovaks, and his stories from Prague are excellent. His Zápisky zo smutného domu is really it has quality of Dostoevsky and really great realism, but under the surface of this realism is deep melancholy. And if you read his books, that really people students it's very boring because it's they grow with it and they have maturity. But if you read it as an adult with experience being abroad, you will understand this. And we have a chapter about expats and migrants, and also there are many there is a translation, I think it's significant for millennial generation who lived abroad and traveled. For example, London, it's Zuzka Kemblová, in original Buchty Schwabachom, and a translation is Moon in the Foil, and it really explains this like experience to be away from home. So it's really brief answer.
Want to say a little bit about Vamos, maybe? This is an interesting.
Yeah, it's
Slovak
another
Yes,
one.
although I was going to say something even more, a little more personal.
Okay.
From just earlier this evening, they were asking me how to pronounce my name. And my father's family immigrated from Slovakia quite a long time ago, about the early 20th century. And so my last name, Sabatos in Slovak, which is actually from Hungarian originally, but I don't know the whole history of how that came about. They were Slovak speakers, Slovak Eastern dialect speakers, but we don't pronounce it that way in the US. Of course, last names always get mutated into different things, so my family's always pronounced it Sabatos. But I usually, because I've been living abroad for 25 years, I try to veer more towards the Slovak. I don't quite dare to say Sabatos, but I pronounce it as Sabatos. It's like somewhere in between. So that's sort of my own little home in the world experience for my own background. With Vamos, that's another interesting case of a writer that, as Tim mentioned, I translated his best-known novel that will be coming out hopefully within 2 years. It was from the 1920s, and it's a writer who, his native language was Hungarian, and he was educated in Slovakia, but then studied in Prague, so he has all these.
I mean, he also studied in London.
He came to the UK and has a couple stories.
And he ends up in China.
Yeah.
And finally Brazil. He actually is buried in Brazil.
Very.
Right, in the rainforest or something.
Brazilian,
Yeah.
Remember the Brazilian episode?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was first in Taiwan, and it's interesting because there's a Hungarian scholar contacted me a year or two ago who's doing work on Hungarians in China, and he randomly ran across Vamos and asked me, and I, of course, I had no information about that period in his life, but he was active in some type of, I don't know if he was trying to bring people there from Central Europe during the war or something like that.
But it's a really interesting point that's coming out of actually what both of you have said. You have Kukuchin, who is the writer of the Slovak village, who in fact spends his time in Prague and ends up in South America. And you have Vamos, who is the writer, this novel is set in a venereal disease clinic in Prague, right? Totally different. This is not the village, this is the corrupted city, but who ends up, in dying of beriberi in Brazil or something like that. But both of them are what it means to be Slovak literature, right? Both of them are different articulations of Slovak literature.
And let's mention an author who's really a huge name in Slovak literature. It wasn't mentioned in that book, I think, František Švantner, who is deeply rooted in Slovak village, but it's not so idyllic. It's it's a very green picture of this rural, threatening, eerie, and weird. And he's really brings something that is not just Slovak, universal, like this dark side of humanity, and it's really something that still lives on. His writings are very popular among students, and amongst readers, and even there was a movie, I think, Piaki, not so long ago. So this, as the other side, you can be in Slovak village, but you can capture some universal experience.
Yeah, and one of my favourite pieces of Slovak literature that hasn't been translated, and we're going to get here in a moment, is Mladý Dwanj by Beasley-Murray, right? Which is a satire, it's a horrific story of village experience, and a satire of Neprebudění, isn't it, more or less?
Neprebudený is the other, because it's...
Oh, that's Timrava, isn't it?
No, Neprebudený is Kukuchin. Timrava is Stapakovci, this is Paradise.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Timrava is another one. It's a great women writer, really great, and she lived in two villages in the borders. It wasn't Slovak-Hungarian borders, it was the south, now it's south of Slovakia, and she wrote things when Professor Zajac compared it to some not Schnitzel, sorry. Yeah, I forgot the name of Austrian writer, like Arthur Schnitzler. Sorry, it's just yeah. And really, it's strong, and her experience was limited. But again, and she was as a woman in the end of the 19th century, she was uneducated because she couldn't study because she had to stay home and things like that. But she wrote such a strong prose and fiction, which was also out of fiction, of course. So it's not like being in the world and gives this experience of big, great, but it's also, you can stay all your life, you can be between two villages as she was, and once she has a great experience going to Martin, which resulted in another great writing, but it's not like where you are, but how talented you are, and I think there are many interesting personalities in Slovak literature who has had this.
Yeah. So I think we've reached the point. Do you think so? Yeah. Oh, Hannah, sorry. Yes.
Yeah. So as somebody kind of almost completely ignorant, my apologies, but from a kind of reception and translation perspective, I was wondering if you could say a little bit on whether there are many discrepancies between what has been translated into different languages, and if some particular works have perhaps found a lot of resonance in different countries, and perhaps others have been unjustly overlooked.
There's very little that's been translated into any. Maybe there's been a little more into German than into English until recently, but one thing that's worth pointing out is how important the English translation is for further translations, because Timarava, the author we were just mentioning, has just come out in Turkish for the first time. But again, there are no translators of Slovak literature into Turkish. It was from the English translation that was published maybe 30 years ago by the University of Pittsburgh. So it would be difficult to speak of a huge resonance, beyond even the fact that there might exist some translations. I mean, there are some translations in French that I know of. And Hungarian is actually quite well, because there was a push with this Slovak Literary Center really wanted, Hungarian, which serves a really important function, but obviously that the Hungarian reader, can become aware of that. But the English translation is the one. I mean, with any smaller literature, it goes beyond just, the native speakers that can serve other functions. So.
One thing we haven't mentioned is translation into Czech, right? That happens these days. And Dvoretsky's name, I didn't spot that in this volume, and he's right. His work is translated straight into Czech, isn't it?
In the last decade, there is a funny tradition to translate Slovak writings in Czech, which is for us, like for generation, it's still funny. And Dvoretsky is translated, but as the structures of book is made in some some notes, like some very dominant topics of Slovak literature, and we have limited space, so we used it for some authors who are translated but maybe not so presented, or they are underrepresented. So, and it gives us a sense to have them there.
Yeah. Okay, I think. Would anyone else like to intervene or object or? Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
One thing. I'm just wondering about Jewish writings and what proportion there are, and I think there's a slight difficulty with being Jewish and Slovak, that I think sometimes people feel that it's difficult to identify as Slovak if actually your family were Jewish. And I know obviously there are a lot of Czech Jewish writers, and I just wondered what the representation was in the Slovak literature.
Yeah, in this book there is this point is not present because we focused on the literature after '89. But of course this is a question because there are many Jewish authors which wrote in Slovak. And it was very complicated because in the second half of the 20th century there was many ideologies and this question was covered, but still there were, Laloha was mentioned, and it's a very strong book and on this experience. And if we have some memory, of course, I think in the part of history, on the chapter on history fiction, there is this question is mentioned, and it's kind of issue of post-memory. For example, daughter writing about, it was Taranenková, writing about this question. I think it was her story because her grandfather was Rudolf, she was granddaughter, Rudolf Dillon, who was very active in culture figure active during Slovak state, and her grandmother was a Jew. And there were very interesting situation where he was a priest, Catholic priest, so. And this is very kind of situation where in personal history this big history is present and these characters are shown and things like that. So yes, this is a very ambivalent question and is reflected, first of all, in the historical fiction. So it's present, but a young author write about this thing as a post-memory, as the stories of grandfathers, not their own.
Did you want to add to that, Regina?
All I was going to say actually was that the Lahola book is called The Last Thing, I think, in English, and is coming out in May with the Carolinian Press, which you can buy very easily online, and also Bednal, The Hours and the Minutes is coming out at exactly the same time. And if you have enjoyed this occasion and you're in Prague in May, then you can meet Ivana and me and Julia. We'll be talking about both books at the Prague Book Fair.
The Bednar, he's not Jewish, but he deals with Jewish experience. Lahola was Jewish and writes explicitly about the Holocaust. Varmush, it's interesting, Varmush as a Jewish Hungarian Slovak should have chosen to write in Slovak, so I guess the question made sense, but that's coming out. So actually in English we're going to get quite a decent representation of Jewish writing in...
And Rosner.
Oh, and Rosner. I mean, there was more than you think, and I wonder, you said, lots of Czech Jewish writers, and then there aren't any, so I don't actually think there's much.
I just don't know.
Oh, I just see. Well, I think there are equivalents, like Atmos Rushtig in Czech, have your equivalent in, let's say, I don't know, in Lahola, Slovak, and we're going to get that in English. I think we should gradually bring...
Can I just add to it? There is a Jewish Slovak musicologist living in Germany. Her name is Agata Schindler, who wrote a book about musicians, composers, singers who survived the Holocaust. She wrote it in Slovak. I translated it into English. It's called Little Teardrop.
Fantastic.
So as you said, there is a lot, but they...
Sorry, let's mention, yes, it's a brainstorming now. Let's mention My 7 Lives, by memoirs, in the form of interview with Agnieszka Kalinova, where this experience of Holocaust is very strongly present. So, yes.
Okay. Well, the time has come. Really briefly, I've said mine. Mine is Pištěnek's Maggie Blanche, a nightmarish picture of Slovak village life. Charles, what text do you think should be translated?
You don't want me to
I can go ahead. I know it's Veronika Šikulova's Meterový plot, and Julia has actually been trying to get me to tackle Šikulova, but I don't feel I have enough experience. I'm just sort of starting to translate, so unless somebody else translates it by the time I develop some skills, maybe someday, but it's a writer who's sort of like Slovak Virginia Woolf in the sense of sort of stream of consciousness and very sort of fluid prose, and it was a really fun challenge for me to translate chunks of her writing for my article. So
Okay, Slovak, Virginia Woolf. Ivana?
Yeah, I have to say that Julia Gephardt made my dream come true, and it's with Jan Rosner, 7 Days to Funerals, because it's a very strong book and it's a testimony of Slovak 20th century. But if I can have some tips, I would like to see Richard Kupala in English, and it's Richard Kupala. And his short stories collection called Návštěvy, Visits. And the other thing, and I think it's Gephardt, there is a very great book, Vítězstavěrsky záchytka, and now I don't know how to translate záchytka in English, but it was a place where a very drunk person who made some noise and they did bad things in publicity, they were taken and until they were sober. How do you have it like here? It's a socialist thing for me. Like maybe there's something here with detention. So, but drunk people detention to not cause some
tales of drunk people detention.
Yeah, and it's and it takes place in East Slovakia. Okay. So it's very specific, and I really like it.
Charles, do you have one, or you?
I was thinking of a couple, but one that I really, this is actually a bit problematic because it's something between a Czech and a Slovak text, but there's a Romani writer from Slovakia, Irena Eliashova, and she has a book of her childhood sort of memoirs, and it's written in Czech, but she uses dialogue in Slovak, so it's a truly Czechoslovak text, which is very rare that actually both languages are used. And it's very hard to find even in Czech, but I think sort of the Romani voice, even though we have a chapter that alludes to it, that's something that could be really built up into the translation.
Okay, well you get to vote on leaving the embassy. In the meantime, in Slovak, right, don't you say that you baptize a book? How do you say it? You baptize a book, normally with alcohol, so rather than launching it. So let us baptize this book, but before we do that, we should give our thanks to these fantastic editors for their wonderful achievement. Ivana, Katarína, and Charles, thank you.
Unfortunately, the UK distributor couldn't get physical books here because of Canadian weather, apparently, delays. So at least we got the coupon and the flyer for you.
So thank you once again for coming, and please have a glass of wine.